So your quote from John Paul II and Konstantin's comments are really powerful because John Paul II actually said that man images God not so much in solitude, but in communion. So if we want the power of God in our lives, men and women need to work together. Men and women complement and complete each other. They do not compete with one another. The problem is that women have been competing with men, and then men feel badly about that competition, so they back off and they become more like women. And so when men and women fulfill their true sexual genius and complement rather than compete with one another, they attain the power of God on earth. So true women assist men in becoming real men. True men assist women in becoming real women. In attempting to exalt women formerly belittled, society has belittled men formerly exalted. In doing this, they obscure and undermine the necessity and the unity between men and women because they need each other. So women trying to be men lose their necessary significance to men.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us here on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We're so grateful. We're excited about this episode. Who are we? We're your hosts. I'm John Heinen. I got my close friend, acclaimed speaker and author, Devin Schadt. Devin, how are you doing today?
Actually, good. Yeah, we had a miracle with my dad who had a brain aneurysm and it looked very bad, but then a miraculous recovery within days. So very grateful.
A true miracle, and really praise be to God on that. I appreciate you mentioning that to the audience here because we were praying for you. My kids are praying for you. The employees at the office were all praying for your father.
God is real, man. God is real. Yeah.
Makes it happen. Amen. So, like I said earlier, we're excited about this. It's going to be a great conversation. We are going to be talking about the global masculinity crisis that both liberals and conservatives are starting to agree upon. In a recent debate on the diary of the CEO, Steve Bartlett, the intelligent and accomplished debaters that were joining ended up finding more common grounds than I think any of us expected, while those listening, including them who are debating. And when you look at the stats, we got 4 out of 5 suicides in America are men. 50% of young men are not trying to date. And while 80% of those won't even approach women because they don't want to, they're afraid of being looked at as creepy or being rejected. I mean, this is where we're at. And it's actually incredible that both sides of the political spectrum are starting to be aware of this, wake up to this, and coming at it from different perspectives on how to solve that. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to actually listen to their public statements today, and we're going to say what they got right and what they're still missing the mark on as we go through this. I'm excited about it. So if you like what we're talking about and you want to support the Catholic Gentleman, you want to hear extended editions of each one of these podcasts every single week, as well as new sessions coming out every month for men, head over to CatholicGentlemanPlus.com. It is a great way of supporting us. We'd love to see you in there. I want to thank our show sponsor today. That's Holy Habits. Can't wait to talk to you about this incredible new habit tracking app that's coming out that's just changing men and women and helping them grow in holiness. And finally, I was looking at our stats inside of Apple Podcast, and I mentioned this last week. I'm going to mention it again. It actually was 75% in the last 90 days of frequent show listeners are not subscribers. So 75%, only 25% of our frequent show listeners actually have clicked that subscribe button. So if that's you, I just really love it if you would click that subscribe button. I have no other way to say it, but it helps the algorithm. It gets more people. If you've listened to us a handful of times, please give us that 5-star reviews. All of these things work with the algorithms, work with the systems to reach more men so that we can change more lives for Christ, set more lives of men on fire for the love of Christ in his church, and help them live better lives. That's our goal. So, like I mentioned, we listened to this Diary of a CEO. I got a couple texts from different folks, obviously Devin being one of them, with, hey, check this out. This is a very interesting conversation that's being had. And when I did, I was really interested. I was refreshed, actually. I was refreshed and I was surprised to hear these men come to common agreements. None of them expected to be talking about young men. I think the episode was actually about what does Trump's election mean for the rest of the world. And I would say 45 minutes of their whole conversation was dedicated in different parts to masculinity and what does it mean to be a man and how do we approach these statistics. And so we're going to go through each of those and talk about them. Devin, when you first listened to it, what surprised you, or what was your emotional response when you heard it?
Yeah, well, like you, I was surprised, very much so, especially with the commentators. And maybe that brings up a good point. Maybe you could fill the listeners in on who these commentators are, because they are really notable experts in their own spheres. So maybe that might be a good
great.
idea.
Let me do that. So if you don't know the Diary of CEO, that's Steve Bartlett. He is, I think, 32 years old, a very successful multi-millionaire entrepreneur. Came out with this great podcast that interviews other just kind of acclaimed individuals in society, from sports to government to entertainment to entrepreneurs, etc. We also had on this debate Scott Galloway. You're going to hear a lot from him. He's a New York University professor. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's actually a political speaker. He has his own podcast. He has his own TED Talk. He has deep ties with the Democratic Party. And he's a self-proclaimed atheist, but an intelligent man who wants to have civil conversations. We also have Konstantin Kisin, I think is how you say his name. And I know him on Trigonometry, his podcast, but he's a politically non-binary. He offers opinions on culture, politics, and comedy. He's very successful, has been on tons of well-acclaimed and notable podcasts and interviews. He's got very conservative views. However, he rejects being called a right wing. He thinks that's gaslighting. He is agnostic, and this is something interesting. He used to be atheist, but now he's agnostic, primarily because he understands the benefit of cultural faith or cultural Christianity permeating society, and the benefits that does for mankind and for getting us to talk to each other civilly, and the world without that he sees as just destruction and doom. He hasn't made that leap. And so actually that's a really good point. We brought it up in the Joe Rogan episode. Pause the episode, say a prayer for all of these men now, that they might be set on fire for love of Christ, that their hearts might be transformed. Only God's grace is capable of doing that. And so then we also had Daniel Priestley. He was the other guy on the debate. And Daniel Priestley is just a serial entrepreneur as well. He's been successful. He is reflective, and he has started to create frameworks to help thousands of other companies reach millions of dollars of success and billions to his name now. And so that's where these guys are coming from. And I would say that they dig into natural law, like a kind of humanist perspective, right? There's a deep understanding of natural law, of the hearts of men, and they're wrestling with it. And they've come up with their subjective reasonings. And so a lot of it are subjective answers. And a lot of it is pretty accurate within truth, because, hey, natural law is written within our hearts, and we know that. And so, yeah, Devin, what were you going back to your initial thoughts when you heard it?
That's great. I think that's excellent. And I just find it fascinating so I think where there is suffering, there is solidarity. So for example, I love William Barclay, who's a biblical scholar. He talks about the 10 lepers, and among them is a Samaritan. Samaritans and Jews had no relations with one another. They vehemently hated one another. To be called a Samaritan, if you're a Jew, was the worst insult. And yet among those 10 lepers, there's Samaritan with them. They're in community. Why? Because that suffering of leprosy harmonized them in solidarity. What we have here, what we're seeing real time on the Diary of CEO, is you're seeing men who are recognizing the suffering and the plight of the Western world, and not only the Western world, but globally. And they're saying, well, what is at the basis of it? And they funnel their way, and they walk through the maze of the conversation, and they all kind of land on this masculine crisis. And then not only that, but they find this great commonality in what they believe in the approach. And you find a conservative, if you want to say that, agreeing with a liberal, and you find these guys agreeing over and over with one another, and it's fascinating. So what you have here is you have a massive crisis, you have solidarity and suffering, and you're seeing a unification that is coming about that may, I think, have consequences on our culture long term.
I love that take. That suffering has brought unity, right? It transcends our ideological differences, right? When we're all suffering, and I think that's exactly what we were witnessing. What I was witnessing, Wyatt, you said fascinated, and I would agree. It was fascinating to me. It was intriguing to me, and that's actually really surprising sometimes. I'd hear, especially Scott Galloway, and how he is able to articulate masculinity. I know with some crass language, but some of it is like pretty spot on, exactly what we need from men. And it's just been from his years of research and study and being a serial entrepreneur himself. And so with that being said, let's jump in and let's listen to Scott Galloway kind of assessing the problem, as I like to say. That's what he's doing. So I'm going to jump over here. We're going to share the screen and take a listen.
Whether Konstantin or Daniel agree with this, I believe the election in the U.S. was supposed to be a referendum on women's rights. Women's rights did not show up. This was a referendum on young men, in my view. And that is, if you look at the two cohorts that swung most from blue to red versus 2020, two of the three cohorts, other than Latinos, was people under the age of 30 who in the U.S. are 24% less wealthy than they were 40 years ago. People over the age of 70 or 72% wealthier. Our tax code is basically an attempt to shove money from the young to the old. And two, 45 to 64-year-old women, who I would affectionately describe as their mother. And that is, when your son's in the basement vaping and playing video games, and I think a lot about struggling young men, you don't give a about territorial sovereignty in the Ukraine, or transgender rights. All you know is your kid isn't doing well. And 210 times a day, your kid's getting a notification that somebody he knows is on a Gulf Stream or partying in St. Bart's, and it's not him or her. And so we not only have young people not doing as well, this pornographic wealth is just shoved in their face. And you end up with, in my opinion, kind of a young, struggling young man. No group has fallen further faster in the world, I would argue, than young men in America. They are, if you go into a morgue in the United States and there's 5 people who've died by suicide, 4 of them are men. 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 has a girlfriend. 2 in 3 women under the age of 30 has a boyfriend. Why? You think that's mathematically impossible? Because women are dating older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. There's 1 in 5 men live at home at the age of 30. 1 in 3 under the age of 25. They're not having sex. They're more obese. They're more depressed. When women don't have a relationship, they oftentimes channel that energy into their professional lives. More single women own homes in the U.S. than single men. Women in urban areas under the age of 30 are making more money than men. When men don't have the guardrails of a relationship or a job or being in school, they pour that energy sometimes into unproductive things, misogyny, nationalism or extreme nationalism, conspiracy theory. In some, they become really citizens. They become sequestered from society. So I'm worried in the US, our biggest threat is a new species of asexual, asocial young men who are incredibly dangerous, have opted out of America. 60% of 30-year-olds used to have 1 child in America. Now it's 27%.
So there it is. And he hit the point of asexual and asocial men. And I mean, what a statement, honestly, right? When I was listening to that, I was just like, oh my goodness, right? Such a unique take. And you know, we talk about it here on The Catholic Gentleman all the time about just this downfall of masculinity, and often, and we'll do that today, you know, understood under the authority of the church and of our God-given roles as men. He doesn't come at it from that, right? He is, I like to say, quite a humanist, and he's got deep roots in love for mankind. And I find this so fascinating because it's not the first time. Seth Godin is a marketer that I follow, and he likewise is a humanist, like to the point where what they're saying is often so much more aligned to truth than what you hear at the pulpit, right? And that it is so interesting because their love of mankind is their arbiter of truth, and their truth is within that. However, it lacks in its fullness. It lacks in its goals. It lacks in its authentic and complete truth, as I was just saying. But it's still so fascinating what he was talking about And I'm glad that he brought it to the front again. I don't think anybody there was expecting this. There was 35 minutes in the talk, and all of a sudden he just starts dropping these bombs with stat after stat after stat. As such a NYU research professor would do. Yeah. So, anyways, Devin, right when you listened, are you worried about the asexual and asocial men of today? Hey, Catholic Gentlemen users, I have a new phenomenal app that I am incredibly excited to present to you today. Are you struggling with a sin that you just keep on falling into over and over again, that recurring sin? Are you struggling to achieve habits that you've set forth? Are you struggling to even start habits that you know are going to better your life? If so, then this app is for you. And frankly, this app is for everyone because it sets you up for success in achieving those goals and achieving those habits that are going to transform your life. It will start at your root sin. You might not even know what that is. This app actually helps you understand that. And then you can set forth these achievable goals, not 15 at once, but maybe 2 or 3. You can have an accountability partner with your close friend, or you can do it with your men's group. It is all encompassing, a really phenomenal tool for us in our lives today. You can start for free now by heading over to holyhabits.app/gentlemen or clicking on that link in the show notes. You can get 14 days for free right now by clicking on the link in the show notes or heading over to holyhabits.app/gentlemen. And I hope to see you in there. God bless.
Well, yeah, I think that, so if you want to be a prophet in the culture, what I see personally is these guys are catching up. So we can, if we want to be prophetic, all we have to do is get a pulse of what's happening in the church. And it was about 20 years ago where many of us had discovered, oh, there's like 61% female attendance and 39% male attendance at Mass. What's going on? And our liturgies are more feminine, they're soft, and the preaching is like very appealing in a general way, but never specific to the leadership of men. And so we saw this coming decades ago, right? And now the secular culture is catching up but they look like they're the front runners, you know? So I find it kind of fascinating how if you just look at what's happening in the church, even though the church at times seems antiquated and archaic and slow, actually what's happening in the demographics of church is a foretelling of what's going to happen in society. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think of that quote from Aristotle Onassis, where he says something along the lines that if there were no women, men would not pursue wealth and power, or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so that's what Scott is getting at is these guys, because of radical feminism, and we can do everything that men can do, and actually we can be men, and we don't need men because they're nothing but sperm donors. Then they've demonized men, and then men feel ashamed of being men. And so then men are afraid to step up and be the leaders in the workplace, be the leaders in the family, be the leaders even economically or even in education. And so they end up, like he's saying, vaping in their mom's basement, watching porn. And they check out because they don't want to risk being shamed for being men. And so, just some of the stats are, I don't know if you're okay if I just talk about some of the stats.
Yeah, I want you to. Just a minute, though, before you get there. I find this idea of vaping in the basement and checking out, right, at its core is these men don't understand their worth. And I want to come into that. And we're going to probably spend more time in Catholic Gentlemen Plus. And I just wanted to state that, or else I would know that it would have slipped my mind, is that when somebody understands their telos, as Aristotle would have stated, as somebody understands their purpose and what they can contribute to society, it changes the game. But these young men do not, and that's dangerous. And what do we see? We see the statistics that you're about to present.
Yeah, and why do you think they don't understand? Is it the teleos or you're talking about the end, right? The goal.
Yes,
the
exactly.
Yeah. Why? Why do you think?
Why do I think? I think, well, honestly, they haven't lived in a generation that's done it. I love that you said radical feminism. And after this next conversation, I want to talk about that because the culture has not been supporting that. Frankly, our church has not been supporting that, has not been clear on that. We had St. John Paul II doing his best to try and bring this to the forefront, but it didn't work to the trickle-down support that we needed at the pulpit, with the realization that we were creating liturgies, we were creating homilies, we were creating full structures within the church that have a very feminine leaning to them, not a masculine-led, masculine-driven one. And when guys check out of religion, when generations of fathers stand outside on their phone while their wives and children are going inside, what are we going to see? They weren't standing on their phone. I get it, generations ago. But what are we going to see is we're going to see
watching
the
NFL
result.
football.
Exactly. We're going to see the result of what we have today. And so that's why these young men, we can talk about the school and educational structure that has failed them and helping them understand it is just about, lowest common denominator, checking off test results and trying to do best for that to get into college. It's all become transactional. It's not about actual learning. It's not actually about liberating them from their pleasures and from their wanton and misguided pursuits. And they lack any sort of appropriate structure to guide them. And then we have the breakdown of the family unit. I guess that could be first and foremost, but they all coincide and they all work together to give the reality that so many men are growing up in, and they're looking at online and looking at headlines oftentimes because they can't read 10-minute article to give their understanding of what is right, what is reality, and what is not. And here we are left with these young men that are just checked out.
Yeah. So this idea of radical feminism, which basically was an outgrowth of women feeling that their rights were suppressed, correct? And at some level, there was a truth to that. But then it became a rubber band effect where the rubber band is stretched too far, and then it's going to snap back. And so what you have is radical feminism went too far, and now it's snapping back where we're realizing now we need men. Yeah. And the women who actually... we'll get into this in a minute, but women actually want the protector. They want the provider. They want the man of strength. They want security. And 78% of women want to date a man who is as educated or more educated than they are. So what that means is they want to step up. They want to have someone who has the ability for acquiring greater wealth, greater provision for them. However, if you look at the stats on college campuses, 55 to nearly 60% of the students on campus, 10.1 million are female compared to 7.2 million men. So the bottom line is, with that is you've got men who, because of preferential treatment to women in education, preferential treatment to women in the job world, they feel overlooked because they are. And then they're like, why even bother? Why even try? So it becomes a condition where they begin to give up. And then they do give up. And then the women are like, where are all the men? I hear it from young ladies all the time is, I wish I could find a husband, but there's no good men available. Well, why? It's because society suppressed them and shamed them for having penises and testicles and testosterone because of their muscle builds and their bone density, and it's a total disaster. So and here's the other thing. According to the Waldinger Harvard study, the key factor in longevity of health, wealth, happiness, life expectancy is based on one thing alone. And it's not based on health. It's not based on your money. It's not based on your pocketbook. It's based on one thing, which we talked about before, which is relationship. If you have one solid relationship, but you're going to have a better life. You're going to be happier. You're going to be wealthier. You're going to have longer lifespan. However, if you look at what's going on right now, 15% of men say they have zero close friends. And from 1990, 55% of men said and this is all Chris Williamson kind of stuff, but in 1990, 55% of men said they had 6 or more close friends. In 2020, that was cut in half at least to 21%. So men with zero close friends increased 500% from 1990 till now. And so, like you said, men are afraid to risk and be shamed and rejected in dating because they're afraid also that in the workplace. They're afraid to try to step up. Why? Because all of these factors based on radical feminist movement. Now, what you have is these guys are actually checking out in the dating scene. They're checking out in the workplace. So they're not becoming providers. They're not living relationally. And that's why you see 4 or 5 suicides in the morgue, like Scott's saying, being men, because they're giving up.
That's right. No, so true. In fact, I think it's a really good segue. Let's watch the next one with Konstantin, who's kind of responding to what Scott says and hitting this point that we're talking about right here. It's an excellent, let's just say, truth bomb that he just throws in, just something that we've been speaking to. All right, I'm going to share my screen here.
It was almost like demonizing men for decades has consequences. I mean, this is what's been happening. Men are the root of all evil, the root of all evil, the root of all evil. Every advert is about, the woman is strong and capable, the guy's pathetic. In every movie, the woman's kicking ass and the man is pathetic. This has been going on for decades. It's a cultural thing as well as an economic thing. And many of us have been saying that when you take meaning and opportunity away from men, if you create an education system that punishes boys for being boys, if you create a society in which traditional masculine virtues become vices, then you will create exactly the sort of thing that Scott is talking about. It's a terrible thing that's been done. Having said that, my message is always the same to young men who I hope are listening, which is the answer to your problems is never going to be, as Scott says, porn and this and that. The answer to your problems is going to take responsibility, go out and get a job or create a business and actually make your life better. No one's coming to save you. No one's coming to help you. There is no, the sort of programs that we have for women where we sort of go, well, let's give them an opportunity here. None of that's happening for men. It's not going to happen because for evolutionary reasons, we just don't feel sorry for men the way that we do for women. That's a reality. I know it sucks. But the answer for men is going to be the answer that's always been the answer for men, which is for you to get off the sofa, to get off the couch and go out and actually do and create and build and find your own way through it. Even if you have to acknowledge that the society you live in has been conditioned for quite a long time to think that you're a piece of because you happen to have the genitalia that you do.
He keeps on going, and it's excellent, right? I think that the self-discipline, self-mastery, right? I mean, that's what he's getting to at the heart of this. And I'm glad that he brought up feminism, and we've already talked about it, right? I mean, from women's suffrage and all the way then turning to these next waves of reproductive rights and Margaret Sanger and Margaret Mead and Margaret Sanger and all these different, just kind of archetypes, architects of the culture of death that have been laid before, had gotten so much clout and so much influence and so much change that I brought something from John Paul II because he says something very similar to what we were just hearing, where he says the creation of woman is thus marked from the outset by the principle of help, a help which is not one-sided but mutual. Women complements man, just as man complements woman. Men and women are complementary. Womanhood expresses the human as much as manhood does, but in a different and complementary way. When the book of Genesis speaks of help, it is not referring merely to acting, but also to being. Womanhood and manhood are contemporary not only from the physical and psychological point of view, but also from the ontological. It is only through the duality of the masculine and the feminine that the human finds full realization. And we've talked about this before, and I know that was a little bit more, it was powerful, right? It was moving. Wasn't as punchy as Konstantin, but we've been saying this, and the church has been saying this for centuries. And so now what we see is the culture. We see this agnostic and this atheist Scott, and agnostic Konstantin, just basically saying, well, the church has gotten it right without putting those words into it. And like you said, they're kind of seeming like the front runners who are aware of this. But that's awesome, right? Like, let's be honest, where truth is found, let us rejoice and let us work to make it go deeper and more expansive. And so I'm so glad that he was able to bring that up and just hit it directly head on. Again, this was unscripted. They were not prepared for this. So what a unique connection that we were able to witness.
Yeah. So your quote from John Paul II and Konstantin's comments are really powerful because John Paul II actually said that man images God not so much in solitude, but in communion. So if we want the power of God in our lives, men and women need to work together. Men and women complement and complete each other. They do not compete with one another. The problem is that women have been competing with men, and then men feel badly about that competition, so they back off and they become more like women. And so when men and women fulfill their true sexual genius and complement rather than compete with one another, they attain the power of God on earth. So true women assist men in becoming real men. True men assist women in becoming real women. In attempting to exalt women formerly belittled, society has belittled men formerly exalted. In doing this, they obscure and undermine the necessity and the unity between men and women because they need each other. So women trying to be men lose their necessary significance to men. That's why men don't care. They don't want any women. Men placating women who try to be men, women who are trying to be men, lose their necessary significance to women. Women don't want another woman. They want a man. Women need women women need men to be men, and men need women to be women.
That's
and
right.
I think what I really love about what Konstantin says is that quit feeling sorry for yourself. Self-pity undermines your power. No one respects a man who self-pities. We respect men who fight to relieve the pity of others. So important.
It is so important. I'm glad that you said that. I want to take a step back and say what we need is that society of healthy femininity and healthy masculinity working together for a better now and for a better future for those that we love and for our children and for the world that that God has created. And I think it's spot on. And so I'm glad that you were able to hit that. St. John Paul II, what a blessing he was to our church at a time that was desperately in need of it and still is. And so that's why we're, here talking the way we are. So wonderful. Let's actually move forward to the next and I think most exciting point of the dialogue that we're going to be able to discuss today. And this is Scott coming back to the front with a certain understanding of what men need, right? So we've assessed the problem and now they're coming at it and trying to discern what is the solution. And so I'm going to share my screen again.
When I was listening to that Zuckerberg interview talking about masculinity and identity issues, one of the lines he said in there sounded like something you've said on my show before, where he said, I think having a culture that celebrates that aggression a little bit more, talking about masculinity, has its own merits that are really positive. Now, Mark Zuckerberg isn't necessarily someone that I saw closely aligning to your worldview. Am I right in thinking that that's something you agree with? Because I remember you saying to me, you think people should be able to walk in a room and kick everyone's ass.
What I've said on your show is that I think the male form, especially under the age of 30, with its bone structure, incredible double twitch muscle, and then this amazing chemical called testosterone, you're going to look back at your 25-year-old self and think, why wasn't I a monster like Steve Bartlett? Because, and also, there is, some masculinity when Russian soldiers pour over the border in Ukraine. You want some of that big dick energy that Daniel was talking about. In the case of Zuckerberg, I don't think he really understands an aspirational view of masculinity. I think when he couches immediately kind of trying to kiss Trump's ass because Trump threatened to put him in prison, and what he used to call moderation, he's now calling censorship. And when you have an algorithm that elevates incendiary, hateful content, I would not describe that as masculinity. For me, masculinity comes down to protection, providing, and procreation. And I don't think I think to talk about gendering a workplace in the context of trying to excuse a total elimination of what I would think is probably healthy moderation. I imagine Daniel and Konstantin might have a different view. I think he's just couching his supplicant, obsequious, kiss-ass behavior under the auspices of masculinity. It just doesn't ring true for me. And I'm not sure we need to man up or fem up organizations and companies right now. When I talk about masculinity, if I say at a conference, oh, women are better managers, everyone goes, yes, that's right. That's right. Right? That's okay. If I say men are more risk aggressive and make better entrepreneurs, you're a misogynist, you're out. And the reality is men and women bring different attributes. But the masculinity and femininity, I think masculinity is a wonderful thing. I think we need a different image of it. I think people born as male have an easier time leaning into those things. Having said that, I work out at CrossFit with a bunch of lesbian firefighters. They bring great masculine energy, and they could carry my ass out of a fire. So a lot of men demonstrate wonderful feminine qualities. A lot of women demonstrate wonderful masculine qualities. I don't think these things are sequestered to anyone born as a specific gender. When I talk about masculinity, I don't talk about it in the role of corporations. I think that's just fraught with risk and not worth talking about. It should be about shareholder value or stakeholder value. I think young men need a code. We're going to church less. We have fewer relationships. So what's the code you hold onto in terms of creating behaviors that are productive for you, yourself, society? And I think masculinity needs to be redefined as something more aspirational, where you're celebrated for being really strong. You're celebrated for not complaining. You're celebrated for creating surplus value. You create more tax revenue than you absorb. You're celebrated for being aggressive. You're celebrated for breaking up fights at bars, not starting them. You're celebrated for protecting your country, not it. You're celebrated for approaching strange women and expressing romantic interest. That's not a crime. And if she's not interested and you're rejected, you're both going to be fine. You're celebrated for getting out of the house. You're celebrated for working. You're celebrated for making money and liking money. I think there just needs to be a redefinition of masculinity in the context of helping young men find a code that they used to get from the armed services or from dual parent households. And I feel like they're struggling. So I like the idea of something that they feel in their bones and in their body and in their DNA that they can lean into, that we celebrate. And the conversation is flipped entirely. 5 years ago, I was called a misogynist for talking about masculinity. Now the conversation is being led and advocated by one group, and it's mothers who are like, my son is not doing well. I got 3 kids, 2 daughters in PR with the other ones at Penn, and my son is in the basement vaping and playing video games. He needs something to latch onto. He needs a code.
Yeah. So, Devin, there's a lot there. And I would love to hear from you first in this full solution and assessment that he, was a bit of a word salad, but he was navigating his way through to an understanding of masculinity slightly off, but at the same time filled with the truth that we know that men need. He even suggested it, right? He said at one point, not going to church. And then he said at another point, getting from their families or from the military, right? And so it's like, he knows, but the solution is not to go back to those ways. The solution is to try, I think of Nietzsche, right? To try and create the Übermensch. When he said God is dead, he wasn't so much saying that, this is a great thing for society. He was arguing, well, what do we do without this worldview? What do we do without these higher authorities? And then he created his own, right? Which is problematic in all of itself. But what were your thoughts, right, when you were listening to that?
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I think it's so funny that Scott and, left, is leaning it toward the center in this. I think it's just hilarious. But
me too.
It's a great insight on his part to understand that men need a code. And I personally call it the code of the Custos. I wrote something on this years ago, but that Custos in the Latin means guardian. And when he talks about men need to feel something in their bones and their blood, well, there's nothing more bony and bloody about a man than being a guardian, a protector, a defender, and fighting for what you believe in and defending it with all your might in order that it may live on. And I think that he's right that young men need a code, but this is the key. No moral code, no man code. If you don't have a moral code, there's not going to be a real code for men. And so without God, and that's the problem here, is that without God, all sacrifice and service that can be attributed to manhood is subjectivized. It's subjectivized ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because because morality becomes ambiguous. It becomes subjective to what I want it to be. So the key to being a man is having an order. And you obtain order not from chaos, but from subjecting yourself to an outside order. And the true order that we're to subject ourselves to is God. Yep. And then once you subject yourself to God, his order begins to live in your order, and that moral order takes place, and you live from that point of view, and then you become a guardian and defender of what's right, true, and good. And that means your wife or women and overcoming lust, working with excellence and encountering failure and owning up to it, and then rising above it by being dependent on God. It means not having sex outside of marriage and not fornicating and not having affairs. It means not using contraception. It means literally to die to yourself for what is right. But the problem is that the boys in our culture, and I was one of them, I was very much a boy, effeminate, soft, believing that it was what you wear, what you drive that actually makes you a man. No, what makes you a man is not being a rebel. It's submitting yourself to an order that's greater than yours and not saying, hey, I'm not going to subject myself to an authority like God because that's weak. I'm going to be the rebel. Well, the rebel lives in chaos. And then he ends up, like Scott's saying, vaping in his basement, watching videos and porn. And then he doesn't have anything to contribute back to society. So we need a moral code, and that moral code is based on God and his truth. And without that, we're shifting. You know, we don't have a
moral
compass.
code is exactly right. And so I think that's what's problematic. And I'm just going to go right there with Scott's view. His assessment is correct. His solution is actually correct too, but his foundation is sifting sands. It's going to be the same thing. It's going to be him creating this code and then him suggesting to others how this code should better adopt. And then it's just basically the code of Scott that makes a lot of sense, that's statistically supported, that's looking pretty good, but is struggling to get any takers, right? Because it lacks that full authority and it lacks that foundation. When I even think about the code of chivalry, you bringing up moral, I talked about it needing a moral code. They need a moral right and wrong. When you even talk about the code of chivalry, I think the reason why so many Catholic men like that is because it's rested on the foundation of the Catholic moral code. It is rested on a moral code. When you go through the codes of chivalry, there's various different versions of it, but they're all like protecting God and country. They're all about, loving Our Lady. Like that comes into different codes of chivalry that were just wildly accepted as something worthwhile pursuit, protecting the vulnerable.
Defending her doctrines and defending her glories. So when you're talking about defending and honoring your country, defending and honoring your Holy Mother, defending and honoring the Eucharist, this is where manhood is born. And he's right when he talks about, I don't think, he said this in the interview, he said, I don't think hopefully I'm going to get this right, but the rite of initiation doesn't take place by graduating basically 8th grade or by going to confirmation. And I think what he's getting at is a rite of initiation is when men learn to sacrifice for the sake of another. That's that guardian, that's that protector, all built in. And again, we cannot get away from the etymology. We cannot get away from the roots of what sacrifice really means, which is to make something holy, right? And so Christ sacrifices himself because he is setting that aside as himself as holiness to God, but also to make us holy. And so I think Scott said that, we men, we need to be protectors and providers, which is what Catholic men evangelists have been saying for decades, protectors, providers, and they said procreators, which is refreshing to hear from a leftist Democrat who, basically wants to, proclaim abortion and contraception, et cetera. But now he wants to move beyond the 1.5 child per family kind of thing. Great. But it's not that. It is protector, provider, and priest. And this is what is missing in the spirituality of men is that they do not know how to lead, and I was one of them. We do not know how to lead spiritually. I was one of them. We need to move forward in being great spiritual leaders who are the connection between heaven and earth, between God and our children and our wives.
I can only agree because it's true, right? And I think that what we see, and I'm going back to this, is what you just kind of got to in that statement of Scott's truth. Procreation, he does bring up, but at the same time, he is very supportive of abortion. And so there's like this there's like this tension and this disconnect within their own phrases because it's based off of their own assessment of the world. And I think maybe a safe way of approaching this, or even the correct way of approaching this, is it lacks the why. So we've got the problem that we've assessed, and we've got a solution that can fix that problem. But why is that solution better than my solution, or better than another man's solution, or better than these men that just want to rest in their basement and vape and watch pornography? I mean, they think maybe they're having the best life, and we all know that they're not. And deep down inside, they know that they're not, and they're struggling. But without that why, without that essence of a higher authority, a higher purpose, a higher goal, you'll always be found wanting. And actually, that is something that I would argue within this every day, is that at the end of these lives, at the end of Scott's life, without finding Christ, without finding a goal, he's looking back on his life and he's balancing the scales. Did I provide more? My worth, my base, my whole life, in whether it was a success or not, is based off of if I provided more than I took out, which is not a bad in and of itself, but how limited to the fullness of the human person. And instead of looking to the goal of eternity, instead of looking to the goal of more. And even then, when push comes to shove, when we don't talk about original sin, when that is something that is completely removed from the conversation, how are you going to effectively make decisions when no one's watching? How are you going to be able to constantly and consistently have that self-discipline, that discipline of mind to always look at others with respect and with their love and with due? How are you going to be ever able to consistently wake up in the morning, eat healthy, do what's right? And I mean, that's white knuckling it, right? That's white knuckling it for the sake of some sort of future in which you can look back and say, okay, I lived this well. And you can look in the mirror and say, well done, good and faithful me. And so anyways, I hope I'm making sense with all that, but I do think that as great as it is in what he's saying, it can be so much greater. It is so much greater. The truth is so much greater.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is that Scott finds the superior transcendence or the aspiring meaning of a man born in that surplus value that he talks about. And he says the surplus value is where your tax worth, basically you're contributing more wealth to society than you're sponging off of it. And then that's kind of like this definition of manhood. You're kind of giving back more than you're taking. Well, there is a truth to that. But like you're saying, without the heaven goal, without the beatific vision goal, without getting my family to heaven goal, it doesn't matter how much money you're making and how much you're giving back to society. You're still got an empty life when you're looking back, because all this that you gained, what good does it do for a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul in the process, Jesus says. So in a sense, the code has to be all for that why, which is to glorify God, to have communion with God, and lead others to God. That's the big three.
Amen.
You don't have those three, you don't have any code. And as a father of St. Joseph, I believe that there is a code. It is embracing silence in yourself, silence before men. That is not being loud and proud and boasting. It's silence before God, sacrificing in secret where other people don't know, but you're sacrificing on behalf of them for God. I believe it's embracing woman. That is embracing woman in her total eye, upholding her dignity, defeating lust in the heart to bless her and protect her, and then loving your wife and bearing her burdens as your own so that your children can learn how to love like a man, or how a man should love. So if the girls, they grow up to want a man like that. I think it's also to embrace the child. That is by being the face of the father, the touch of the father, the voice of the father that they cannot see, feel, or hear. And then I believe it's by assuming your charitable authority, to lead by loving, love by leading. So you lead your family in prayer. You lead your family in sacrifice. You lead your family in service. You lead your family to mass and confession, the sacraments, and loving Jesus and honoring the Father. And if you can apply those 4 pillars to your life, you are living the code. And that code is brilliant, because that's the code of St. Joseph. That's the code of the Custos, the true guardian, St. Joseph. The what do they call him? The guardian of the Redeemer, and Redemptoris Custos. This is, if we can embrace this spirituality, this code, we will set the world on fire. And to be surplus value to society, I don't give a rip about that. That is going to happen if I'm living that code. Just consequently, naturally, it's going to happen.
There it is. It happens when you're living a virtuous and holy life. When you are striving for holiness found in virtue, found in God, all of that stuff is going to happen because you're inevitably going to be denying yourself. You're inevitably going to be carrying your cross. You're inevitably going to be loving your neighbor. And that is just so good. So let's actually move on to the last one on the public edition of the episode here. And that's going to be, Steve asks all the three of them who all have sons, what would they tell their sons to live a better life? And so we're going to listen to that one right now and enjoy their responses.
Guys, thank you so much for all of your perspectives. One of the things I realized as you guys were talking is that you're all fathers. And you're all fathers of boys, although you're fathers of boys at different ages. So I wanted to just give you all 30 seconds, if you could. And this is maybe me asking for myself for this advice. But based on everything that's happening in the world, which can feel incredibly confusing, especially to young people, where we're getting a lot of our information from different echo chambers, what is the advice that you would all give to your young boys that would best prepare them for the future and the next couple of years? Starting with you, Dan.
Yeah, so I've got a 6-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old son, and a 10-year-old son. It's an incredibly confusing time because preparing them for a world that's fast changing is difficult. We're taking the approach of a lot of general knowledge across a lot of things so that you can use AI to run deep in different topics. We're encouraging the kids to interact with supervised AI conversations and have, like, letting them know that technology is available. We're also just focusing on some manual skills, like how to fix a boiler and how to saw through some wood and those kind of things. And also we're doing things like acting classes, being up on a stage and performing. So all of those kind of typical things. But to be honest, it is a point of anxiety in my life, just thinking about what the world looks like for 10 or 15 years from now that they're going to be going into. So if you get clear answers on this, I'm really open to learning.
For me, my son's 2.5, so it's a little bit early for this pep talk. But my message to him is, when he's old enough to hear it, is going to be this: your grandfather, your great-grandfather, my grandfather, was taken as a slave laborer from Soviet Ukraine to Nazi Germany. Your great-grandfather was born, your great-grandmother, rather, was born in the Soviet Gulag. Your great-grandmother lived through the German occupation and is now living through Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. You are not living in the worst time ever. You're surrounded by pussies. If you are a man and if you do your job and if you learn the skills that you need to do and if you pursue the things that you want to do with your life to the best of your ability, if you believe in yourself, if you believe that you're talented, if you actually achieve the things that you set your mind to, there's never been a better time in the history of humanity than now. You're surrounded mostly by people who feel sorry for themselves. If you're not one of them, you're going to clean up. Young women are looking for a young man like you who's actually going to stand up for himself, who's actually going to go out there and achieve and be confident. Be that, and you're going to clean up when it comes to finding the right partner for yourself. You're going to clean up when it comes to making money. You're going to clean up when it comes to your career. You're going to clean up on every front because the bar has never been lower. The bar has never been lower. So just go out and be a man, and life is going to be great.
I'm older. I have 14 and 17-year-old boys, and my observation is you can't tell them anything. The best you can do is you can try and model behavior for them. So I'm trying to be really kind to their mother. I'm trying to show them that, if you're serious about having a good family, you got to be a generous, loving partner. I'm trying to be in great physical shape, which is getting harder and harder. I'm trying to be aggressive around them in terms of business and trying to be kind. And what I do talk to them about the concept of surplus value. I'm like, you're takers right now. The UK school system, which is amazing, is investing a lot in you and you're giving almost nothing back. Me and your mother are loving you a lot more than you're loving us. You're just taking resources everywhere. You're a net negative. And your crossing to manhood isn't sex or some religious ceremony. Your crossing to manhood is when you start creating surplus value. You're loving more people than you're absorbing. You're listening to more complaints than you are complaining. You're creating more revenue than you're absorbing. That's the notion. It's surplus value. And I have this trick called What a Man Does. And I've been doing this when they're kids. I'm like, guests show up, a man goes and gets their luggage and puts it in their room. A man's constantly scanning the table for empty water glasses. And I mean, one of the proudest moments I ever had was when like my 6-year-old boy, who was all like 30 pounds, got up and went over this gigantic pitcher of water at this table and like started like trying to pour other people's water, and everyone had no idea what was going on here. You know, I do these things called What a Man Does. A man asks a woman out for coffee. A man pays for women. I'm a sexist that way. I've told my men, my son gave me this rap on, oh, Dad, you're so establishment. I'm like, do you ever want to have sex? I'm like, then you need to pay. I mean, that's the bottom line. Anyways, but what I would say is I'm trying to model good behavior or be a good role model. But I agree with Konstantin and Daniel. I think every day they have more potential to lead the most amazing life in history. I'm not a nihilist. I'm not a catastrophist. I think I have big problems, but given the blessings of the sons born to these men and future sons that you'll have, Steven.
So great. I loved it. And I think that we need more of that. In fact, just watching this probably for the third or fourth time, let's all again say a prayer for Scott and for Steve and for Daniel and for Konstantin, because if these men found the fullness of truth, all of the missing pieces in their systematic worldview and puzzle that they have laid forth would all start making sense, would all come together in a very unique way. I mean, hearing Scott talk about living the model, and what was the first one he went to? Loving his wife. I mean, it's incredible. It's just, it's so there again, but lacking the why. It's just lacking that experience and that statistics and stuff, which is great that he's able to do that. So let us say a prayer for him that this man finds Christ, that he has that moment of conversion, definitely harder the older you get. So let's pray for him that might be something that he does. And so I loved this idea of giving to others, right? What is it? It was like loving. I love my wife. I'm leading by example. He did some practical examples of what does a man do? I do that with my kids all the time. I actually always I'll sit down and I'll look at my sons and I'll say, hey, it's time to man up. What do we need to do? And 80% of the time they don't get it right. And so I'm like there to guide them and there to coach them and there to lovingly lead them. And that's what he's doing. And then he talked about basically self-giving, right? Your transformation in manhood is when you are giving more than you are taking, is what he's saying. And that's really great. I think I love that. And I'm grateful for what he was able to speak to such a secular audience, that this already has like 3 million views, that video. And so I'm glad that he was able to speak some of that. Konstantin, when kind of the stoic manner, right, is like, it is going to be a white knuckle, but it's that self-discipline. And then you're going to clean up, as he was saying. And then Daniel, his honesty and his approach to just be more broad and everything like that. I appreciated the honesty in all of them. Devin, what were your thoughts when you were listening?
Yeah, I think that what happens when Scott's wife or the children leave the home, then what's going on there? Who does he model the behavior for then? Because if that's the why, that's going to give out, right? I'm not saying it will give out. I'm just saying that he's got to have a better why. And I'm not ripping on him at all.
Agreed.
So the why is really union with Christ. And I think that the key, he's right on. And really the language here is sacrificial leadership and sacrificial responsibility. This is what men are made for. So the man is meant for sacrifice, and sacrifice is the duty of man. And when men get this, but this is the problem. I know so many young men, or I see so many young men, what they do is they try at it for a couple days, or they try to better their life. So the bottom line is work harder, right? Learn more, educate yourself, pursue your passions, I guess, master your flesh, pursue excellence. But what they do is they try it for like a couple of days and like, it's not working. I don't feel any different, or it's not getting better. Well, it's not a quick fix. You have to be in it for the long haul. And I think the problem is without the Konstantin, he's a dad. His kids are getting the good info. Scott's kids are getting, modeled behavior. So Dan, same thing. They're all involved fathers. The problem with our culture right now is we have a bunch of boys who are remaining boys because they weren't raised by men, because their fathers were boys or men trapped in boys' bodies. So what really needs to take place is we need to figure out ways of reaching these boys trapped in men's bodies. I was one of them, and try to train them to say, look, it's going to be difficult for the short. In this momentary, or this, as you're trying to work harder, as you're trying to pursue excellence, you're going to encounter failure. Embrace that and figure out with God how to get over it. The root is if I have, like Konstantin was talking about confidence. The first time that you get hit with something that shows how weak you are or that you're a failure, your confidence is blown up if you don't have God. But God purposely allows us to experience failure and weakness and limitedness so that we learn to rely on him all the more, so that he helps us to overcome our limitedness, our weakness, and all that, so we can become more powerful men and we can understand the weaknesses of others and be compassionate and lift their burden from them. So I think that the big part of raising boys to men is saying, this isn't just for a day or 2 days. You do this for the rest of your life. And there is no real goal like, I'm going to lose 30 pounds in 3 months. No, I'm going to have a healthier body. I'm going to have a stronger body. I'm not going to learn to pray in 30 days and just have this mystical experience. No, I'm going to actually be a saint by the end of my life. Yeah, it's the long-term life. What do I want to be really? Not what is my short-term goal.
Yes. And not to dog on them. I think
they're great.
Because you brought that up. We did an episode on loving our sons and what our sons need. We broke it down into 5 different things, right? Of kind of a high level is respect, healthy discipline, living examples of love, challenging them, and that not just living the example of love, but actually having for your son an authentic and unconditional love that's spent in time, that's spent in intentional conversations, daily words of affirmation, and all those sort of things. And so I all of what they stated, Daniel and he's working to give his kids agency by learning how to use a saw. Amazing. Absolutely. Konstantin and basically his self-discipline and mastery, that sort of stuff. I mean, the fact that he has such a genealogy of great, individuals. And I guess that's we were made for greatness, and he understands it, even if he can't articulate it, right? We were made for so much more. We were made for greatness. And look at your relative, look at your great grandparents and what they've had to overcome so that you could be alive and that you could be here. And Devin.
Yeah. One of the greatest enemies of boys trapped in men's body, or young men aspiring to be men, or even middle-aged men trying to be men, is surplus collective vice. And what I mean by this is, so a pop is not bad in itself. It's a great pleasure. And maybe a muffin, during snack time or whatever, or all these things in themselves, one at a time, there's nothing wrong with them. They're pleasurable. But it's when there's a collective of these things where I'm giving in to the can of pop, where I'm giving in to the extra meal, where I'm giving in to the snack, or binge watching on it. It's a collective whole that creates this viciousness of sloth, laziness, and it creates a way of life. This is really what's attacking men. So if we could just start separating out the collective of the viciousness of the vices and saying, okay, I'm going to attack this one and cut this out. I'm going to give up this one. And then that way they cannot collect as a whole that burdens us and causes us to be lazy and indulgent. Then we would start to have power.
Yeah. So good. And so we're here at the end of our episode on the public edition. If you like what we're talking about, head over to Catholic Gentleman Plus. We're going to listen to one more clip, and we're also going to go into a deeper dive into what they're lacking when it comes to not addressing sin and its issues, and how we can make this more appealing to men today, especially these men that are so distant, that are vaping and watching who knows what in their parents' basement. And so I want to go to this point in our episode of Putting on the New Man. This is the weekly challenge to our men. So we've been talking a lot about sons. We've been talking about a lot about children. My challenge to you is, if you have sons, you need to be intentional about doing something with them this week. I know that weeks can go by when you haven't been intentional, where you've been seeing them, you've been loving them, you've been having dinner with them, hopefully, but you've never actually done anything outside of that. You haven't gone and thrown the ball with them. You haven't gone on a walk with them. You haven't gone on a bike ride or wrestled with them or anything like that. So my encouragement for you, those of you who have sons, is to make that intentional this week. If you have daughters, take them on a date. Take them on a daddy-daughter date. Live for your children as they need you and they deserve for you to live for them. And finally, if you don't have any kids, I want you to pray for those who do have kids. Pray for your future kids. Pray for your vocation. We all need this. We're all in this together. So thank you, Devin, so very much for this edifying conversation. I'm always grateful.
Me too, John. Thank you.
And as we end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.